Her name was Lily, Lily Mae Dawson. She was 11 years old, and she had the kind of smile that could warm a room the way sunlight warms an old wooden floor, slowly, gently, and so completely that you didn't even notice it happening until you were already wrapped up inside it. Lily had cerebral palsy. She had been born with it, grown up with it, learned to carry it the way a sailor learns to carry the weight of water, not by pretending it wasn't heavy, but by finding a way to move forward anyway. She wore a small pink hearing aid behind her left ear. She walked with a slight rolling gait that made her right leg swing outward with each step, and her left hand sometimes curled inward at the wrist when she was nervous or excited. But those who truly knew Lily, her mother, her teacher, the old man at the corner bookstore who always saved her the newest graphic novels, they didn't see any of that first. What they saw first was her eyes. Big, deep brown eyes that held the kind of quiet intelligence and warmth that made adults stop mid-sentence and children instinctively scoot closer. That Tuesday, Lily and her mother, Carol, had stopped at Rosie's diner after Lily's physical therapy appointment. It had been a hard session. Lily had worked for 45 minutes on strengthening her grip, squeezing a soft resistance ball over and over while her therapist counted quietly beside her, and by the end, her hand ached all the way up to her shoulder. But Lily hadn't complained. She never did. Instead, she had looked up at her therapist with those big brown eyes and said, very seriously, same time next week. And her therapist had laughed, because what else could you do in the presence of a child that brave? Carol Dawson was a single mother. She worked as a night shift nurse at County General, which meant she ran on coffee, love, and a particular kind of exhaustion that lives so deep in the bones it becomes almost indistinguishable from ordinary life. She had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide, and she wore her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that was always slightly lopsided, always just a little undone, the way the life of a working single mother always is. She loved Lily with everything she had. Every shift she worked, every hour she spent on her feet in sterile hallways smelling of antiseptic and worry, she did it thinking of Lily. Thinking of therapy bills and school supplies and the new adaptive keyboard that Lily's teacher said would help her write faster. Carol wasn't rich, she wasn't even comfortable, but she was devoted, completely and without condition, and on days like this one, she made sure to stop at Rosie's diner because Lily loved their grilled cheese sandwiches more than almost anything else in the world. They chose a booth near the window. Carol helped Lily slide in, tucking her bag beside her, making sure the seat was comfortable. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and fried food and that particular kind of lived-in comfort that only old diners carry, the kind of smell that feels like it belongs to everyone and no one at the same time. Lily pressed her nose briefly against the cold glass of the window and watched the people walking by outside, her breath fogging up a small circle on the pane. Carol smiled watching her, flagged down a waitress, and ordered 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, 1 chocolate milkshake for Lily, and a large black coffee for herself. They were laughing, actually laughing, Carol doing a terrible impression of Lily's physical therapist counting repetitions in an exaggerated voice while Lily giggled so hard her milkshake straw fell out of her hand, when the group walked in. There were 4 of them. Teenagers, 15, maybe 16 years old. 3 boys and a girl, wearing matching school jackets from Westfield High, moving through the diner door with that particular kind of loud confidence that teenagers sometimes wear like armor, the kind that announces itself in every room it enters, that takes up more space than it was offered and dares anyone to say something about it. They were the kind of group that instinctively scanned a room not for a place to sit, but for something to notice. Something to comment on, something to use. Their eyes landed on Lily almost immediately. Carol didn't notice at first. She was pouring sugar into her coffee, still smiling at her own bad impression, still caught inside that warm bubble of ordinary Tuesday happiness. But Lily noticed. Children always notice these things faster than their parents. It's a skill they develop through necessity, through the accumulated experience of knowing, long before a word is spoken, exactly what kind of attention is coming their way. Lily's smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded the way a song fades when someone slowly turns down the volume, note by note, until the room is quiet and you can't quite remember what the music sounded like anymore. The group slid into the booth directly across the aisle from them. The tallest boy, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and a mean, restless energy that seemed to live just beneath his skin, leaned over and said something to the girl beside him. The girl laughed, a sharp, deliberate laugh, the kind that is designed to be overheard. The boy glanced at Lily again, said something else, more laughter. Carol looked up, She saw the looks on their faces. She had been a mother long enough, and a nurse long enough, to read a situation the way a sailor reads weather, quickly, and with a very clear understanding of what is coming. She set her coffee cup down slowly. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She reached across the table and covered Lily's left hand with her own. "Don't pay attention to them, baby," she said quietly. Lily nodded. She picked up her milkshake straw and put it back in her glass. She stared at the table. The tall boy was not done. He leaned into the aisle slightly, just enough, and in a voice that was pitched to Carrie, to be heard not just by Lily but by everyone in the surrounding booths, by the couple at the counter, by the waitress refilling ketchup bottles 3 tables away. He said, "Hey, what's wrong with your arm? Why does it do that?" And then he demonstrated, curling his own arm inward at the wrist, contorting his face into an exaggerated expression, and his friends dissolved into laughter again. The sound of it filled the diner the way smoke fills a room, insidiously, getting into everything, impossible to ignore. Carol was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. Her voice was controlled but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Excuse me," she said clearly, looking directly at the group. "That is my daughter, and you will not speak to her that way." The tall boy looked at Carol with the particular kind of contemptuous boredom that teenagers sometimes use when they want to signal that an adult has absolutely no power over them. "Relax," he said, with a lazy shrug. "I was just asking a question." "You were mocking a child," Carol said. "Whatever." He turned away, back to his friends, already dismissing her, already moving on to the next thing, and his group laughed again, quieter this time, conspiratorial, sharing the joke in a way that excluded everyone else and made the exclusion itself into a kind of power. Carol stood there for a moment, breathing. Every nurse learns to manage their own adrenaline, to feel fear and anger and still move calmly through a crisis. She was doing that now. She sat back down. She looked at Lily. Lily had her eyes on the table. Her right hand was wrapped around her milkshake glass and her knuckles were slightly pale. "Hey," Carol said softly. "Look at me." Lily looked up. Her eyes were bright with the specific brightness of tears that haven't fallen yet. "You are extraordinary," Carol said. "Do you hear me? You are extraordinary, and nothing that boy says changes that. Not one single word." Lily nodded, swallowed, said, very quietly, "I know, Mom. But the thing about cruelty is that knowing doesn't always protect you from feeling it." And 11-year-old Lily sat in that booth and felt it, the sting of being seen not as herself, not as the brave, funny, book-loving girl who never complained during therapy and always saved the last page of every new graphic novel for bedtime because she wanted something good to look forward to, but as something lesser. Something to be imitated and laughed at. Something that invited mockery by simply existing in a public space. She picked up her grilled cheese sandwich and took a small bite, even though her appetite was gone. And then the tall boy did something that nobody in that diner expected. He stood up from his booth, crossed the aisle in 3 long steps, and before anyone could move or speak or process what was happening, he reached out and knocked Lily's milkshake glass clean off the table. It hit the diner floor with a crack, the glass shattering, chocolate milkshake spreading across the worn linoleum in a slow, dark wave. And in the stunned, horrified half-second of silence that followed, he leaned down close to Lily's face and said, quietly enough that only she and Carol could hear it, "Freak." Then he straightened up, looked around the diner with that same lazy contempt, and then, open-palmed, sudden, shocking, he slapped Lily across the cheek. The sound of it was horrible. Not loud, just sharp, real, the sound of a hand against the face of a child. The kind of sound that empties a room of all its ordinary noise and replaces it with something that can only be described as collective horror. Lily's head turned with the impact. She made a small sound, not a cry, exactly. Something smaller and worse than a cry. Something that sounded like the last note of a song being cut off before it could resolve. Carol screamed, not in fear, in fury, in the primal, absolute, unstoppable fury of a mother whose child has just been hurt. She was around the table in an instant, pulling Lily to her, putting herself between her daughter and this boy, and her voice when she spoke again was entirely different from any voice she had used before, low and shaking and completely unambiguous. "You do not touch my child," she said. "You do not ever touch my child." The boy stepped back. For the first time, something flickered in his expression that wasn't contempt or boredom. Something smaller. Something almost like the awareness that he had crossed a line he perhaps had not fully intended to cross. The diner had gone completely silent. Every person in the room was looking. The couple at the counter. The waitress with the ketchup bottles. The elderly man in the back booth who had been reading a newspaper. Every single person was looking, and every single person was still. Nobody moved. Nobody intervened. Nobody stood up. The silence itself was a kind of answer, the answer that a room full of bystanders gives when the moment of decision is harder than staying still. The boy's friends were no longer laughing. And then, from outside, came a sound. A sound that started as a low rumble, distant and approaching, growing steadily louder until the windows of the diner hummed faintly with the vibration of it. Engines. Motorcycle engines. Not one or two, many. The distinctive, unmistakable, sound of a large group of motorcycles rolling into a parking lot, cutting their engines one by one until the final rumble settled into silence. Everyone in the diner heard it. And nobody, not Carol, not the bullies, not the waitress, not the elderly man with his newspaper, had any idea what was about to walk through that door. The door of Rosie's diner opened with the familiar jingle of the small bell above it. And then they came in. One by one, and then all at once, filling the doorway and then the entrance and then the diner itself with their presence. Big men in leather vests and worn boots and road-weather jackets, some of them with long beards, some with tattoos that traveled all the way up their necks, all of them carrying the particular unhurried, unmistakable energy of people who have spent years moving through the world on their own terms. There were 12 of them. 12 members of an organization called Rolling Thunder Veterans, a motorcycle club made up entirely of former military servicemen and servicewomen who spent their weekends not at bars or rallies, but visiting children's hospitals, escorting abuse survivors safely across state lines, and fundraising for disability advocacy groups across the country. Their leader, the man who came through the door first, who held it open with one hand while the others filed in behind him, was a man named Ray Kowalski. Ray was 53 years old, 6'2", with hands the size of dinner plates and a voice so deep it seemed to come from somewhere below the floor. He had a gray beard that reached his chest, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw from a roadside bomb in Fallujah in 2004, and eyes that were the particular shade of steady blue that belongs to people who have seen genuinely terrible things and decided, consciously and deliberately, to spend the rest of their lives making the world quieter and kinder in response. He wore a vest covered in patches, his unit designation, his years of service, and in the very center of the back of the vest, a patch that read, "We ride for those WHO cannot." Ray had not intended to stop at Rosie's diner. The group had been riding since early morning, heading to a children's hospital 3 towns over where they had promised to deliver toys and spend the afternoon with kids in the long-term care ward. But one of the bikes had a tire that needed checking, and someone had spotted the diner from the highway, and Ray had pulled in because Ray had learned long ago that the best moments of his life had started as unplanned stops. He came through the door and in the first 2 seconds, the way military training and decades of experience will make you do, he read the room. He saw the broken glass on the floor. He saw the dark spread of the milkshake. He saw Carol, standing between her daughter and the group of teenagers, her face pale and shaking and set with the specific expression of a mother who has been pushed to her absolute limit. He saw the tall boy, the one still standing just slightly too close, whose body language was still carrying the residual energy of someone who had just done something violent. He saw Lily, small in the booth, one hand pressed against her cheek where the red mark was already visible from across the room, her big brown eyes wide and glassy and her whole body pulled inward the way a person pulls inward when they have been made to feel that simply taking up space is an act of transgression. Ray took all of this in approximately 2 seconds, and then he did not raise his voice. He did not storm across the diner. He was not dramatic, not aggressive, not any of the things that the situation might have seemed to invite. He simply walked, steady, deliberate steps across the diner floor toward the booth, and the 11 men behind him spread out slowly through the room the way water spreads, quietly, inevitably, filling every corner. He stopped in the aisle. He looked at the tall boy. The tall boy looked up at him, and whatever was left of his earlier bravado, whatever thin and borrowed courage had allowed him to strike a disabled child in a public place, evaporated on contact. He took a step back. Then another. Ray still didn't raise his voice. He said, "Son, sit down." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even entirely a command. It was something harder to argue with than either of those things. It was a simple statement from a man who had stood in the middle of actual war zones and held the line, and the teenager understood this in the wordless, instinctive way that people sometimes understand things they can't articulate. He sat down. His friends, all 3 of them, who had been inching toward the door, sat down too. Ray turned to Carol. His voice changed completely, softer, unhurried, the voice he used with frightened children in hospital wards. "Ma'am, are you and your daughter all right?" Carol opened her mouth, closed it again, and then did something she probably hadn't done in front of a stranger in years, her eyes filled with tears. Not from sadness, exactly. From relief. From the sudden overwhelming sensation of not being alone in a moment she had been completely alone in for what felt like a very long time. "She was just sitting here," Carol said, and her voice broke on the last word. "She wasn't doing anything. She was just sitting here eating her sandwich." Ray nodded once. He turned to look at Lily. Lily was watching him with her big brown eyes. The red mark on her cheek was vivid. Her left hand was curled slightly at the wrist, the way it did when she was nervous. She was clearly trying very hard to hold herself together, and she was doing it with the particular, heartbreaking dignity of a child who has had to develop that skill far too early. Ray looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that nobody in that diner expected. He pulled out the chair across from her, not the bench across the booth, just the chair at the end, so he was at her level, so he had to angle his giant frame down and forward to meet her eyes. He sat in it carefully, this enormous scarred veteran with his gray beard and his road-worn vest, and he folded his enormous hands on the table in front of him, and he looked directly at Lily, and he said, very quietly, "What's your name?" Lily blinked. "Lily," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "Lily," he repeated, as if confirming something important. "That's a strong name. You know that." Lily shook her head slightly. "It is," he said simply. "I've known some very strong women named Lily." He paused. "How old are you?" 11, she said. 11, he said. He nodded slowly, as if 11 were a perfectly respectable age. "I got a granddaughter about your age. Her name is Sophie. She's got cerebral palsy too." He said it the way he said everything, directly, without flinching, without the particular careful softness that people sometimes use around disability that ends up feeling more like distance than kindness. Just the fact, delivered simply, because facts deserve to be spoken plainly. "She's the toughest person I know. Present company included." He said the last part with a small, deliberate smile, and something shifted in Lily's expression, something small and careful, like a door opening just a crack. "She rides with us sometimes," Ray continued. "In a sidecar. She thinks it's the best thing in the world." He tilted his head slightly. "You ever been on a motorcycle, Lily?" Lily shook her head, and now there was something alive in her eyes that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. Behind Ray, the other 11 members of Rolling Thunder veterans had, quietly and without being asked, arranged themselves throughout the diner. 2 of them had already spoken quietly to the waitress and were helping clean up the broken glass from the floor. 3 of them had positioned themselves near the booth, where the teenage group sat, not threateningly, just present, just immovably there, just large and calm in the way that certain people are large and calm, so that doing anything foolish in their vicinity became an obviously poor decision. 2 more had sat at the counter and ordered coffee, and were talking to the elderly man who had been reading his newspaper, and who was now talking back with more animation than he'd likely felt all day. Ray stayed with Lily. He talked to her for 20 minutes. He told her about Sophie's love of motorcycles and horror movies and competitive chess. He told her about the children's hospital they were heading to, and the kids they'd met there over the years, kids who were dealing with things that would have broken most adults, who somehow kept finding ways to laugh and imagine and want things. He listened when Lily told him about her graphic novels, asked which ones were her favorites, and when she named 3 titles, one of the men at the counter, a quiet, compact man named Dennis who turned out to have a brother who wrote comics, lit up and joined the conversation for a moment before returning to his coffee. Ray told Lily that she reminded him of Sophie, not because of the cerebral palsy, because of something in her eyes, the quality of her attention, the steadiness of it, the way she looked at the world as something worth looking at. Lily was glowing by the end of it, not performing happiness, actually glowing, the way children glow when they are genuinely seen and genuinely engaged with by an adult who is bringing their full, unhurried attention to the conversation. Carol sat beside her daughter and watched all of this and said very little, because sometimes there is nothing that needs to be said. And then Ray stood up, straightened his vest, and turned to look at the booth where the 4 teenagers sat. His expression didn't harden exactly. It settled into something very clear and very direct that was more effective than anger by a significant margin. He walked over to them slowly. He stood at the end of their table. He didn't sit down. He looked at the tall boy for a long moment without speaking, And the boy, who had spent the last 20 minutes watching Ray talk to Lily, who had watched the 12 bikers quietly fill the diner like a tide coming in, who had watched the broken glass swept up and the two women at the booth across the aisle slowly unknot from their fear, had the particular look of someone who was in the process of understanding something they should have understood long before now. "You know what I did for 23 years? Ray said quietly. The boy shook his head. "I wore a uniform and I went to places most people can't find on a map, and I watched boys your age, 18, 19, 20 years old, make decisions in moments of pressure that they carried with them every single day for the rest of their lives," Ray said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Some of those decisions were the kind you can be proud of. And some of them weren't. And the ones that weren't, I watched those boys carry them. For years. Like weight they couldn't set down. He paused. "What you did today to that little girl, that's the kind of thing you're going to carry. Whether you know that right now or not." The boy was silent. His face had changed in ways that are hard to describe, the mask of casual contempt entirely gone, replaced by something younger and less certain and considerably more uncomfortable. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," Ray said. "You're old enough to figure that out. But I'm going to tell you something you can take with you." He leaned forward very slightly, so the boy had to look directly at him, had to meet those steady blue eyes. "That little girl has more courage in that left hand that curls at her wrist than most people develop in an entire lifetime. And the fact that you couldn't see that when you looked at her is not her problem. It's yours." He straightened up. He looked at the three friends as well, letting the silence sit for a moment. And then he said, very simply, "You're going to go over there and apologize. And you're going to mean it. Or we're going to have a very different conversation." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. And then the tall boy stood up. His friends followed. They walked across the aisle. All four of them stood in front of Lily's booth, and the tall boy looked at Lily, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and said, "I'm sorry. What I did was wrong." His voice was rough with something that might have been shame, and shame, when it is real and earned and spoken aloud, is one of the most valuable things a person can feel. "I'm really sorry," he said again. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Those big brown eyes, steady and unafraid. And then she said, with a directness and a grace that silenced every person in the diner, "Okay. Thank you for saying that. Not I forgive you." She was 11 and she didn't owe him that, and she was smart enough to know it. Just acknowledgement. Just the clean, dignified receipt of something that was owed to her. And it was more powerful than any elaborate forgiveness scene could have been. The teenagers left. The diner slowly returned to its ordinary sounds, coffee cups, conversation, the clatter of kitchen plates. But the atmosphere was different now. Warmer. The way a room feels warmer after a fire has been lit in it. The Rolling Thunder veterans stayed for lunch. All 12 of them. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Darlene who had stood frozen behind the counter during the incident and who had spent the 20 minutes since quietly crying into a dish towel, refused to accept payment for any of their meals. Ray argued with her about it for 5 minutes. She won. Before they left for the children's hospital, Ray came back to Lily's booth. He reached into the front pocket of his vest and pulled out a small pin, the kind that members of Rolling Thunder gave to special visitors when they came to the hospital. It was a small silver motorcycle with tiny wings. He set it on the table in front of Lily. "That's a rider's pin," he said. "We give those to people who've got the kind of courage that belongs on the road." He looked at her seriously. "You qualify." Lily picked up the pin with both hands, her right hand steady, her left with that gentle inward curl at the wrist, and she held it carefully, and she looked at it, and then she looked up at Ray and said, "Will you tell Sophie I said hi?" Ray's face, that big scarred weathered face, broke into a smile so wide and so genuine that it seemed to briefly make him look years younger. "I'll tell her exactly that," he said. He stood. He buttoned his vest. He walked to the door, held it open for the others, and one by one the 12 members of Rolling Thunder veterans filed out of Rosie's diner and back into the cold November afternoon, mounted their bikes, and rode away down the highway toward a children's hospital where a ward full of kids were waiting for them. The sound of their engines faded slowly, like a distant storm moving on, like the end of a piece of music you weren't expecting to love as much as you did. Carol sat beside Lily. Lily was holding the pin. Outside the window, the last of the motorcycles disappeared around the bend. "Mom," Lily said quietly. "Yeah, baby, I want to tell my teacher about today." Carol looked at her daughter. At the red mark on her cheek that was already beginning to fade. At the pin in her hands. At those big brown eyes that were full, not of pain anymore, not of the humiliation of earlier, but of something else entirely. Something that had been placed there by 12 strangers in leather vests who had not had to stop, who had not had to stay, who had not had to pull up a chair and ask a little girl her name and treat her story like it mattered. You should, Carol said. She put her arm around Lily's shoulders. You absolutely should. They sat like that for a while, the two of them, in the warm diner that smelled of coffee and grilled cheese, watching the highway outside where the tire tracks of 12 motorcycles were slowly filling with new fallen snow.